Good evening, you're watching Reality Check. I'm Vishnu Shobh. On the program tonight, a key member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Panel, Rathin Roy, joins me to look at the report of Arvind Subramanian, who till just a year back was the Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister. In his report, Dr Subramanian said that India's GDP was not growing at 7% or more than that. It was, in fact, growing at closer to 4.5%. Now, that report resulted in howls of protest. Some said that the report was entirely incorrect, though there are those who believe that India's economic growth has been overstated and that the sanctity of statistics generated by arms of the government need a relook. So is Dr. Subramanian's analysis based on cherry-picked data, or is there something there? Now, I must mention that we have made efforts to reach out to Dr. Subramanian, not just for this program, but also for two previous programs that I have anchored. We have not received a reply from him in any of these cases. I'm joined now by Rathin Roy, the member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. I'll be joined by my other panelists as well. Rathin Roy disagrees fundamentally with what Dr. Arvind Subramanian has come out with in his report. Now, I'm just going to go through several of the key quotes that you've actually come out in your report, Mr. Roy, and I want you to explain to our viewers, a broader audience over here, why exactly you feel the way that you do. For starters, you've said that Dr. Subramanian's report would not stand the scrutiny of academic or policy research standards. Now, what he has said in his report is that he's open for others to actually access his data. He is open for others to comment on his views as well. But why do you believe that what he's produced so far doesn't stand policy research standards?
Thank you, Vishnu, and thank you for inviting me on this program. Let me start by saying that Dr. Subramanian is a very well-respected economist. I personally have a lot of respect and regard for the work he does. The fact that his data is going to be put in the public domain is welcome. I'd just like to point out that has not yet happened. When it happens, we can no doubt have a more engaged empirical conversation. But the reason why I believe that this working paper, which is unrefereed, would need a lot of work before it would be acceptable either academically or as a policy proposition is manifold. The fundamental reason, in a sentence, is his main point is that GDP growth is overestimated by 2.5% by the CEO, by the CSO.
Okay.
I reject that, and I reject that on the ground that he has provided no alternative measurement of GDP.
Okay, Rathin, I'm just going to interrupt you because we'll be discussing all of that. I'm just trying to break it up into points. So point number one, you feel that the report doesn't look, it's not an academic paper in the sense that it's not been peer reviewed, and therefore it's not substantive enough for you. So that's point number one. That's basically what you're saying about the research standards. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. It could have been, but as it happens on reading it, it's not.
Okay, I'll get to the other points.
Peer reviewed, but
sure.
It is not at this stage.
I'll get to the various other points in just a moment.
Sure.
Dr. Pranab Sen, the former chairperson of the National Statistical Commission, with us as well. Good to see you, sir. How have you been? Do you also believe that this particular study, it's not been peer reviewed, it's cherry-picked data at a basic level, and therefore it's not the gospel truth?
Well, let's take them one by one. Number one, it's a working paper, and no working paper is peer reviewed. Presumably, when he sends it for publication, it will be peer reviewed, but till such time it isn't, and there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. It still is an academic work. So far as cherry picking is concerned, he has used 17 indicators. They are fairly comprehensive. They are, of course, they don't go into the same kind of details that any GDP calculation goes through, but one really can't accuse it of cherry picking. That I think would be a sort of misstatement, because if you are an independent researcher rather than the CSO, this is the data you have available to you.
All right. Okay. Rathin, now in the study which you have come out with, you say, and I quote, the analysis of 17 indicators appears incomplete if not obsolete. Why do you believe so?
Because there are many other indicators that one could have picked. And
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, there's an echo, I beg your pardon.
We'll fix the
there are
echo.
many
Yeah,
other indicators that could have been picked. And I think the word obsolete, perhaps we could phrase it differently, of course, but the what it refers to is this, and I'll explain it very simply for your viewers. If at the time of independence, in 1950, you had a certain composition of GDP, and you come to 2019 and apply that composition of GDP or those indicators then to GDP now, you'd probably come up with a GDP growth rate of 3%, simply because agriculture then was predominant. And in a fast growing, changing economy like India, there are compositional changes in GDP that happen. And to pick indicators that perhaps were correlated with GDP in 2004, and then to take the same indicators and say that they're not correlated with GDP now, could also mean that the indicators that are correlated with GDP has changed simply because the composition of GDP has changed.
Okay. Point number, well, there are lots of points, so let's call it point number 3 if you've done 2 already. Rathin, you say the logic of using tax data appears to be, I beg your pardon, the logic of not using tax data appears to be a convenient argument meant to avoid inconvenient conclusions based on hard facts. Why do you believe that the inclusion of tax data would have made Dr. Subramanian's study more substantive?
Mr. Subramanian has chosen to not do the one thing that one does when one measures GDP, which is try and provide an estimate of value added. Because when we measure GDP, we provide an estimate of value added. When we look at an indicator like car sales, we are looking at something that can act as a proxy for value added. So if he was going to use all these indicators, there's a wealth of other data, including tax data, to which he had access as chief economic advisor. Even I, as director of NIPFP, did not have access to that data, and he could well have used it. He chose not to, and I'm puzzled why, because if he is going to look for alternative sources of data to make the claim without measuring GDP, that GDP is mismeasured, then it's an obvious thing to use tax data. And I'm not quite sure why he has not done that. That's all. I personally am not casting any aspersions on him for not using the tax data. I'm just puzzled, man. You're using 4-wheeler data, 2-wheeler data, credit data, export data, non-CSO data. Why not use tax data? Question. That's it. Just a question.
A very polite question, I might add. Dr. Sen, the fact that he, again...
I'm very polite, Vishnu.
Rathin is not using the word cherry-picked, at least so far not in this conversation, but I think he seems to suggest that some of the data used in the study is cherry-picked. The lack of tax data he indicates is, again, I'll say what he said, it's a convenient argument meant to avoid inconvenient conclusions. Do you believe that tax data should have been included as well?
Yes. Let's be very clear. Earlier, when we used to do GDP calculations, that's prior to 2011-12, tax data was not used. Okay? A lot of the indicators that Arvind has used in his study were actually used directly in calculating GDP. Since 2011, tax data is used.
Yes.
Now, the point is that if you are taking only the data that was used in the old calculation,
yes,
and not data that's taken in the new calculations, then you are in a sense biasing your set of variables in favor of the past and not the present.
Okay.
And I think that's the point that Rathin is trying to make.
Okay.
And I think that's a legitimate point.
I just, Rathin, another point that you've mentioned, just sort of following up from what you told me a little while back. You believe that Dr. Subramanian's study has a blind distrust in a governmental institution that has served India. You're talking about the CSO. That appears unwarranted for a neutral academic. Do you believe, again, that not referring to CSO data was essentially flawed? Why do you say so?
Well, I probably would have used, I'm not the sole author.
Right.
So let me temper those adjectives to suit me. I would say that, look, the CSO is a public institution. It is subject to scrutiny by Parliament. It is subject to scrutiny by government. It is subject to scrutiny by economists such as Pranab and myself. It is subject to scrutiny by NDTV. And therefore, the CSO publishes what it measures and how it measures it. I have one caveat to that, which I'll mention in a minute. Now, with the CMI data is produced by a private institution. I or the general public do not know the basis of how they get their data. You actually have to pay to secure most of it.
Yes.
And therefore, my only plea is, do not, at least treat CSO data with the same seriousness, if not more, as you would treat the CMI data. I found a certain reluctance on his part to take this data as being at least as credible as CMI. That's my limited point. Now, there's a wider point that other people, not Dr. Subramanian, have made, that the CSO should be really releasing more of its data, for example, the MCA database, than they're doing. And I join with that, I agree. I think all data used in the calculation of national income accounts should be put in the public domain. But I would just point out to the general public that the CSO as a public institution is subject to multiple scrutinies, which private data is simply not. And therefore, it is fair to ask why data produced by an institution which is subject to public scrutiny is taken more lightly than data that is relatively opaque, paid for in the private domain, without casting any aspersions on the quality of CMI data. I'm just stating facts.
Okay. Dr. Sen, is it also not true that in March this year, 108 economists did raise questions on data associated with the GDP numbers? They spoke about the new GDP series, and they said, and they also raised issues about the quality of data being generated in this country. Is there a fundamental problem with the data now being produced?
You know, if you read the letter that was signed by the 108 economists, they make 2 points. The first point is that the current method of calculating GDP has certain flaws which need to be ironed out, and that is absolutely correct. But the more fundamental point that they make, and that's what the body of the letter is really about, is that there is now evidence that the government is suppressing data. And they cite 2 examples from the very recent past. One was the GDP back series that had been produced by the National Statistical Commission, which was put on the website and then withdrawn. And then a completely new series was put out, which had exactly the opposite result. And the second was the suppression of the employment data. So, the sense that the government was actually suppressing information was what they were objecting to. Now, as far as the GDP data is concerned, that's something that really is still work in progress. We know that there are weaknesses in it, and these weaknesses would need to be corrected systematically. And there are really 3 big weaknesses that one can talk about. The first, of course, is that the prices are not appropriate for the data set that we are using, which is the MCA. We need to revise the prices. And that work it was work in progress. I don't know where it stands today. The second problem was that a very large amount of our economy is in the informal sector.
Yes.
And what we are doing today is we are assuming that the informal sector grows at the same rate as the corporate sector.
Yes.
Now, that is really stretching your imagination a little bit.
Okay.
So, one needs to correct that. That also is work in progress.
Ratin, would you like to respond to a couple of the points mentioned over there? Basically, the formal sector and the informal sector, the assumptions which are made towards generating the GDP data right now, and the very strong point that Dr. Sen makes about how there is a sense that some data has been suppressed in the recent past.
Yes, I would like to respond to that by saying that both these are valid points, and I wouldn't go so far as to say suppressed, but if there is data that is used to calculate the GDP, it should be released as soon as possible, and some kind of coherent communication
Yes.
needs to come out from government as to why this series is why this data is not being released. I have also been waiting for the GDP back series for years now, and whenever I went to the CSO, I was told that it's coming, and that's fine, but that's not optimal, right? So I'm completely with Pranab said there, but let me point out in the context of this particular interview that these are not things that form any basis for Dr. Subramanian's case that the GDP growth rate of India is overestimated.
Okay, fair enough. Another point that you have written about, I mean, you among others, and let me quote again from that. In a rapidly changing economy like India, something counterintuitive cannot be a reason for national alarm. Do you really believe that Dr. Subramanian's work is something which has caused national alarm, that it's actually it's hurt our reputation? Because he sort of approached it from the standpoint of an academic, raising larger issues, but at one level there are many who believe that GDP numbers are sort of associated with national pride, and they shouldn't be.
No, it's not a matter of national pride. He happens to be, I hope he remembers, the former chief economic advisor to the government of India. And when the former chief economic advisor to the government of India says that for a multiple number of years now, our GDP growth rate has been much lower than we said it had been, it means, for instance, that India is a much smaller economy than it was. It means, therefore, that investment opportunities in this country are potentially much more limited than they would have been if our GDP was growing at 7%. It also means that we have to call into question then our development performance indicators. The very basis of looking forward at economic opportunity in this country is caused challenge, because he's not talking about 0.25 or 0.5, he's saying 2.5%. That is a very serious matter. And therefore, yes, there would be good cause for alarm, and that is why I and many other economists have immediately dropped what we are doing, taken him very seriously, looked at his work, and we conclude, and I conclude, at least I can speak for myself, and I want to say this very firmly, that there is no basis on the basis of what he has done in this paper to make that kind of conclusion. You might say that there's a mismatch in correlations. Some people talk about smell tests. I'm not a canine handler. I'm not aware what those are. And that is one level at which you may sort of worry about how India's GDP is calculated. But to make, for a chief economic advisor in a Harvard working paper, a definitive statement that, hey, India's growth rate was not 7, it was actually 4.5, and for many years now, that is a serious matter. And therefore, you have seen so many of us responding.
You've also said in the report, or the report says, Dr. Subramanian's study uses simplistic econometric techniques which are demoralizing and also technically inappropriate. Who does it demoralize?
Not me. So I can't speak for that particular
Your name
book.
is attached to it.
But
and
I can say that
so it is
one
you
very
as well.
important. Yes, of course, my name is attached to it. There are 5 people there, and if all of us were not demoralized, that's a good thing. I certainly wasn't. So I'll leave it there, if I may. But if I go on to the other part, which is his technique, so let me explain my take on this.
Yes.
My take on this is as follows. If you're going to look at indicators and not offer an alternative measurement of GDP, then what I would expect you to tell me is, what are the drivers of Indian growth? Now, the way a good economist answers that says, what is the theory of Indian economic growth? Based on that theory, what model of Indian economic growth do you have? And when you construct it, you will be able to then explain what the growth rate of GDP was. And now if you're finding indicators that challenge that growth rate, they therefore challenge the model and therefore the theory, then that would be an interesting and important quest. But there is no theory in this paper. It is entirely data driven, and therefore I must call it to account. In terms of what precisely the use of the purely data driven and quant techniques mean in terms of his principal case that the GDP growth rate of this country has been underestimated. We have at length, and I have myself in my own article in the newspapers, pointed out why these correlations do not automatically lead to that inference, and why his cross-country regression, which I am happy to explain, does not automatically lead to that inference.
I'll come to the
Because
cross-country.
it's a very serious inference.
I'll come
and
to the
therefore,
cross-country
drawing
regression
that
in
inference
just a
must carry
bit.
weight. But there is no theory behind that inference.
Yeah.
There is no model behind that inference, and the quantitative techniques by themselves do not enable us to make that inference with any plausibility, with any foundational basis.
Dr. Sen, and then I'll open up this discussion to my other panelists. I know, Ratin, you may not want to be a part of that, but Dr. Sen, one of the points mentioned by Dr. Subramanian was that weak job growth, financial sector stress may be directly linked to modest GDP growth. He sort of explains the lower numbers which he believes exist through examples. Financial sector stress, we know that is a fact. Weak job growth, the government numbers have come out, they're appalling at one level. Is there not a direct correlation?
The point is that I think what Ratin is trying to say is valid, which is if you start with a premise, and the premise being here that the GDP growth was 4.5% and not 7%, then all of these issues do come up. But you have to integrate it into a working model of some variety. And now when you do integrate it in a working model, you really have to ask the question that what are the various little bits and pieces that one has to look at? Am I looking at them all, or am I looking at a particular set of data, concluding that growth is only 4.5%, and then saying because it's 4.5%, it is probably caused by these two factors?
Yes.
It's in terms of logical progression, that's not right. That's not the way to go about it, right? You seem to have assumed, on the basis of whatever analysis has been done in the Harvard working paper, that the growth was actually 4.5%. I would contest that.
Okay.
On the basis of the analysis that he has done. I am not saying that the growth has not been overestimated. That's not my point. But it is not overestimated for the reasons that he has stated.
Right. Ratin, one final question to you. The regression model that you were referring to, which has been applied by Dr. Subramanian, why do you believe that is not, it's not accurate in gauging how different parts of our economy contribute to our GDP?
Well, firstly, cross-country regressions cannot be accurate because it is cross-country regressions. What they do is they take 70 countries' growth rates and they say, okay, so if you draw a line, then this is where these countries fall. And the closer to the line they are, essentially the closer to the average of these 70 in a best fit sense.
Okay.
Now, what he's saying is that India was close to the line before 2011 and was offline, therefore what he calls an outlier after 2011. But it's interesting, he also says that China and Ireland, we'll leave Ireland aside, but China was offline. Fine. Now, the problem with this regression is you are assuming that no other country in that sample changed its process of GDP estimation, one. Two, you are assuming that the dependent variable, which is GDP, the one on the left-hand side, that variable is calculated more or less homogenously across all 70 countries. That's an implicit assumption.
Okay.
But he does not state these. And if he does not state these, I cannot go and find, I've now discovered this, so I'll go and find out. That's going to take some time, whether these assumptions are indeed valid. But the most important thing in this comes from my point about theory. So here's a theory for you. I have no basis for this theory, but I can posit the theory because he has none, that the reason that India and China are outliers, especially India, post-2011, is that India is the fastest growing economy in the world. And therefore, it is going to be an outlier with respect to other countries when you draw this line. And it was not the fastest growing economy in the world in 2004, and therefore it was not an outlier. Now, this is an extremely empty statement to make without, my giving you supporting evidence and a full theory. But if I'm presented with a cross-country regression like this, which is theory-free, it fits this theory. So you see, it's a highly unsatisfactory professional state of affairs when you use a purely data-driven cross-country regression to argue the point that Arvind argues for this reason.
All right, Ratin, thanks very much for joining us. I know you don't want to get into a larger debate, which I'm having. You're happy to stay on if you like. I actually found the use of a quote from Descartes in the beginning of your study.
I'd love to stay and listen if I may.
You absolutely. I listen, participate. You can shout as well also if you like. We allow that as well sometimes, though not as loudly as others. But I found the use of a quote from
I don't do that.
I found the use of a quote from Descartes particularly interesting in the study. Right up top. I don't think we have time really to discuss why you chose to have that quote. But I want to introduce my other panelists who've been listening in. Shantanu Gupta, political analyst, joins us. Shantanu, I know you've been waiting, but thanks very much for being with us. And Mr. Ashok Desai, the former Chief Advisor, Finance Ministry, Government of India. Thanks, sir. Shantanu, Ratin, possibly too polite to ascribe political motives. Are you somewhat less polite? Do you believe that Dr. Subramanian's study all of a sudden was politically motivated?
I think exactly. I think Mr. Ratin was too polite. I think to my mind, I'll call it the intellectual dishonesty of the ex-chief economic advisor. He was the chief economic advisor and he didn't say a word around this during his tenure. Recently, he written a book, very famously. He has put a photo with finance minister. He marketed in India very well. He did various sessions. He never mentioned anything close to it, any of his sessions. I attended a couple of them. So I think I call it a complete intellectual dishonesty. Though I think Mr. Ratin told in little complicated words to the understanding of your viewers. My understanding is, first of all, he used the private party data, CMI data. And when he is doing a non-CSO data, for some reason, he failed to take into account the tax data, which is a hard data, which is not even a survey. So even to a normal mind, you smell a cat. That's why a chief economic advisor who was there at the helm of the affair never uttered a word, and why in his book, he famously launched recently, he never uttered a word. And in a non-peered paper in Harvard, all of a sudden he comes out with this new theory, and not by 0.25, 0.5, 2.5, and it had a serious repercussion.
Okay, all right.
After a decade and a half, we increased our Moody's rating. Investment potential is very good. All of a sudden, you get this data.
Okay, Shantanu, 1 second. I want to bring in Ashok Desai as well. Do you believe that this wasn't just an economic study, that there was something larger there? Or do you believe that this was a true indicator of things which are going wrong in our system, in our economy, in our GDP numbers?
First of all, whether it is motivated or not, I don't know. But I assume, since he is a good economist, I assume that it's not motivated. And secondly, I would look at not the motivation, but the facts, or rather the hypothesis. He doesn't really have facts, but he has given some correlations and said, look, for these reasons, this GDP growth must have been lower. It's something to be looked into. It's not something that has been established.
A couple of the points that he says, and this is just reading from his numbers, from his work. In fact, this is from an article, a quote: urgent reform required by recognizing that growth has been tepid, not torrid. He says that must restore the reputational damage suffered because of data generation, and the methodology and implementation for GDP estimation must be revisited by an independent task force. Is there anything necessarily wrong in these suggestions?
I think it is particularly right to say that there should be an independent task force. This question cannot be settled by opinions.
And he's calling for that. He's calling for an independent task force. So you would agree with him on that?
However high a bureaucrat, he can't by his opinion decide what is right. The facts have to be established by by professionals.
Well, if I might interject, I think there's a lack of information and understanding. Indian national accounts are under constant scrutiny by about as high an expert body as you can ask for in this country. There is a standing body called the Advisory Committee on National Accounts, which includes the who's who of the statistics and economics professions, and nothing happens in the GDP calculations that do not go through the mill and oversight. If you take out the ACNAS and say that they are compromised, because it's precisely their decisions which are being questioned, you're not going to have too many economists left to fill up your expert body. You'll probably have to import them.
Okay, fair enough. The other point, Shantanu, if you'd like to come in on this, just on the point of, a political motive, if any, he's actually written about this, and he said, look, there is nothing political. He says there is no political motive to alter GDP numbers. He says substantive work on GDP has been done by technocrats under UPA 2. So he doesn't ascribe any motives to the last NDA government in bumping up these numbers. He says GDP growth was bumped up in the last year of UPA 2. So why do you then believe that, there may have been some sort of political motive?
I'm saying, I don't know it's a political motive or it's generally harming a country's reputation. Because
why would you want to harm India's reputation? I don't buy that.
I'm saying that I don't know. I'm saying we have cases, multiple cases where foreign NGOs, foreign intellectuals are being funded to change the
But this was the gentleman who was trusted by the Prime Minister as his chief economic advisor till less than a year back.
He's talking about it. It's not a PhD thesis of some Johnny sitting in some ex-university. It's ex-CA, Arvind Subramanian. He's a name in the world. He served in IMF. He's presenting a working paper in Harvard. That's why we are talking about it. So I don't know the motive, but someone coming out with a calculation which has multiple holes and is talking that a country is overestimated by 2 to 3%. I'm saying this is something fishy for sure. This is not academic. This is for sure not academic.
Just on the point, sir, on substantive work on GDP was done by technocrats under UPA 2. It was towards the end of UPA 2 that Dr. Subramanian feels that there was a bump up in our numbers. Do you believe that inflation of GDP numbers, the exaggeration of GDP numbers was inaccurate?
However good the people may be who did the work, it is perfectly possible that the figures need to be revised. New data come in, some data may be proved wrong, and so there is nothing wrong in re-looking at figures. He is saying, look, these figures don't look convincing. They should be looked at again.
Okay. Dr. Sen, the numbers?
Look, these, as I said, the numbers should always be looked and re-looked, checked, rechecked. It's a process, it's always work in progress. The economy changes, data changes, the way you think about systems change. It should happen, it must happen. The problem is giving the impression that systems are not in place, that this is actually the figment of some bureaucrat's imagination. I strongly object to that. You're really doing a great deal of disservice to some very, very fine experts.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah. In fact, the study which has been done now by the Prime Minister's Economic Council has a quote from Simon Kuznets, and I think it's particularly interesting. It says, the valuable capacity of the human mind to simplify a complex situation in a compact characterization becomes dangerous when not controlled in terms of definitely stated criteria. Do you believe that Dr. Subramanian was vague?
I don't think so. For one thing, this is an extremely elaborate sentence which doesn't really fit the case.
Why does it not fit the case?
Because he was not doing anything of that sort. It's a very simple paper. He's saying, I correlated these with our GDP growth figures, and for just these years, they don't fit well. So it's possible that these figures are wrong. I don't see anything wrong with saying this.
Okay. Shantanu, would you like to respond to this point, that he's not said anything wrong? You can agree or disagree with what he says, but he's not said anything profoundly wrong. And we shouldn't necessarily sort of characterize his work one way or the other. It's a statement of concern, perhaps not more than that.
I think we would not have done a personal character assassination if he would have spoken during his tenure as CA. Has he got this gyan all of a sudden based on a data? Second, if he has written something bit of this book, we would not have done that. And he's cherry picked the data where India is looking bad. I think it's almost looking like that I'm trying to take a data which will narrate my pre-biased judgment. I think he will not take a tax data, he will not take the CSO data, he will only take CMI data which suits his narrative. And that's why there is a doubt on his integrity.
Just half a second, sir. Ratan, were you raising your hand? Were you trying to say something?
Please. Yes. Can I have one sentence, please? I'm going to say one thing, and that will not contradict anything that Ashok Desai has said. I think that Arvind Subramanian's claim that Indian GDP growth is not 7% and is closer to 4.5% is not proven in his work and is profoundly wrong. And that is completely consistent with everything that Dr. Desai has said. Thank you.
But let me again add,
Yeah.
this is again personal experience. I completely disagree with Shantanu. When Arvind was the CA, I was chairman of the Statistical Commission, and he has repeatedly during that time asked me, look, I don't understand the data. I spent a lot of time trying to explain what was going on, but he did ask Shantanu. So let's not work on partial facts.
It's an honest. It's an honest assessment, is what you're trying to say, one way or the other. You can disagree with it as you. Can
Yeah, I mean, I will not
right.
ascribe motives to what has happened, and I think that is wrong. I disagree with what he has done,
Right.
but that's on technical grounds.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's so many points which have come up in this, and I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us. We haven't really dealt with some of the hard economics which has now come out by the study done by Rathin and the others. But I think the larger issue on the quality of the work which has been produced, whether there was any motive, whether there was any intention, or whether it was actually a statement of fact, that's something we have sort of dealt with. And obviously there are different opinions out there. I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us.